Hey everyone, so in the last week's video I looked at each of the uniforms for the defenders and tested their base build without any other changes just to see how good the uniforms are. As you can see from the start of this video, in this one I'm going to be upgrading each of their characters, so taking Daredevil to T3 as well as taking Jessica Jones, Luke Cage and Iron Fist to Transcendent. I was considering testing just the Awaken stage at first, but I felt like that would be a little bit too many steps for testing, so I just decided to go straight to Transcendent instead. The testing this time around will be pretty similar to last time, since I want to show the progression of the characters when you upgrade them. So this means that I'll be showing each of the characters in the same world bosses that I did last time, so Thanos as well as Proxima, Corvus, and Call Obsidian. And my build will not have changed at all, it's only that the characters will be upgraded to T3 and Transcendent. Besides that, I'll also be showcasing how the characters perform versus Null and also versus Galactus. After that, I'll also show how the characters perform in Timeline and Alliance Conquest, as well as upgrading the characters to max to show how they perform in those modes. And basically by max build I mean I'll be taking the characters to top 10 or higher. Oh, also when I talk about Alliance Conquest, I'll mention some of the different groupings that you can have for the characters if you want to kind of stretch out their value and not use them all together. Make sure to stick around to the later half of the video if you want to check that out. This might be a bit of a spoiler before I show the results of some of the testing that I did, but as you'll see here in a few seconds, the stat bump alone on Luke Cage's Transcendence is absolutely insane. The damage increase and the HP increase are just colossal. Simply based off these stat increases and the results that I got from the previous tests without any of these upgrades to begin with, I'd easily say that he's one of the best Transcendent characters in the game, if not the best, at least in regards to PvP. I mean, look at those stat increases. Over 15,000 physical damage and over a 40,000 HP increase. Iron Fist is the last of my upgrades here, and although I didn't show any PvP testing with him last time around, I fiddled around with his build a little bit after the initial tests and was able to get some footage there. Just as a heads up though, he isn't as good as the other defenders in terms of PvP just because he doesn't have that iframe ignore. But in Alliance Conquest, he can put up a pretty good fight, and the obvious trade-off is that he's great at PvE. Jumping straight into the results here, you'll see from my previous tests, Daredevil at level 70 with level 25 gears, no ISO 8 set or custom gear, and basically a bare bones build, was able to finish Thanos with 1 minute and 46 seconds left. So basically I was able to do stage 45 in 3 minutes and 14 seconds. With an identical setup and no other changes besides the T3 stat bump and the T3 skill itself, I was able to complete the exact same stage a full 60 seconds faster than my previous result. That's a pretty substantial improvement considering just that upgrade. Also keep in mind the conditions from the previous video, all the tests are done with 10% pierce and no damage proc at all. For the previous Proxima test, I completed stage 99 in 2 minutes and 50 seconds. And with the T3 upgrade, I was able to complete the same thing in 1 minute and 55 seconds, or roughly about a minute faster. Corvus, I was previously able to complete in roughly about 2 minutes and 30 seconds. At this point, you can see a consistent trend. With the T3 upgrade, I was able to complete the same stage roughly 60 seconds faster, or in about 1 minute and 30 seconds. I obviously couldn't test Null before unless I had the T3 upgrade or the Transcendence for the other characters, but I decided to do this test to show if the characters have enough burst potential to finish off those last 7 to 5 bars for Null in his last phase. You'll notice when the video progresses to the other characters that I tested Daredevil at stage 4 instead of stage 3, and that's because he performs better than the other characters in PvE, with the exception of maybe Iron Fist, but Daredevil does also get that high ignore dodge, which is very helpful since Null has kind of a high dodge stat. That said, again with no other changes, I'm able to complete this stage of Null with 50 seconds remaining. If I was to use a damage proc like a Rage, I wouldn't be surprised if he was able to do past stage 9 with my current setup. I'm also providing my results in Giant Boss Raid, even though I don't think it's necessarily the best mode for showing character improvement. Still, I included the results anyway, and I was able to complete Master Mold previously in about 3 minutes and 10 seconds. But like I was saying, there are usually a lot of factors that can skew the results, so things like latency, if other people attack, which I try to minimize, and if the enemies group up or not, as well as if your character gets brainwashed, among other factors. Regardless, with the T3 upgrade, I was able to complete the mode in about a minute and 40 seconds, which is about a minute and 30 seconds faster than the previous clear. Moving on to Luke Cage, without the Transcendence, I was able to clear stage 40 of Thanos in about 4 minutes and 20 seconds before. After the Transcendence, I completed the same thing in 2 minutes and 40 seconds, or a full minute and 40 seconds faster. Keep in mind that this again is with no damage proc, and to keep the testing consistent, I maintained the same stage levels that I did in the previous tests. So for Daredevil it was 45, and for all other Defender characters it's stage 40 of Thanos. Proxima was done in 4 minutes and 50 seconds before. With the Transcendence, I was able to clear the same thing in 2 minutes and 25 seconds, which is actually 2 minutes and 25 seconds faster than the previous clear. That's a pretty huge buff on its own, and it also looks like it's a bigger upgrade than Daredevil's T3. Even though Luke doesn't have as much burst potential as Daredevil, he is very tanky, which allows him to stay in the fight during that final null animation when he's knocking back, stunning, and dealing damage at the same time. And since Luke accumulates damage for damage taken, then it's more than enough to complete that final part. Giant Boss Raid previously took about 4 minutes, and with the upgrade it took about 2 minutes and 10 seconds, which is around a minute and 45 seconds faster roughly. You may have noticed that my team for Giant Boss Raid changes for the rest of the defenders with the exclusion of Daredevil, and that's because combat types got a damage buff on the days that I was testing. And to account for that roughly 50% damage increase for the type advantage, I swapped out Nick Fury from the leadership to essentially nullify that bonus and have the same testing conditions as before. Since I didn't have Jessica Jones's potential unlocked when I did my first video, I'm going to be including the tests I did with her at level 70 as well as with the Transcendence, so I get the same comparison as the other characters. As you can see here, at level 60 I was able to do Thanos in about 4 minutes and 40 seconds. Then by upgrading to level 70 and level 25 gears, I was able to do the same thing in about 3 minutes and 35 seconds, which is about a minute and 10 seconds faster than at level 60. Although I think this improvement is more associated with reaching level 70 and having the penalties removed from being a lower level than it is for having level 25 gears and the additional stats there. It's interesting to note that I completed this stage 40 seconds faster than I did with Luke the previous video, and I think that's because her damage buffs are always active, whereas Luke's, he has to accumulate the damage when damage is taken. This means that Luke's damage can fluctuate a bit more drastically, and his results can vary a bit more than Jessica Jones. But regardless, the results shouldn't be too far off from one another. After transcending the character, I completed the same thing in about 2 minutes and 30 seconds. So that's about a minute and 10 seconds faster than without the upgrade, and about 2 minutes and 15 seconds faster than when she was at level 60. Her results are also 10 seconds ahead of Luke's, which is in line with what I said just a moment ago. Versus Proxima, I only got to the halfway mark in about 2 minutes and 50 seconds before. Then at level 70, I did the same thing about 20 seconds faster, which isn't really very telling. That's why I kind of focused on the Thanos stages more than these, but just included these anyway since I had already done them before. But yeah, anyways, with the Transcendence, I reached the same halfway point in about a minute and 10 seconds faster, and in roughly 3 minutes I was able to clear the entire stage. If you've been keeping track of the results, that's about 30 seconds slower clear time than I did with Luke Cage. And that makes sense here because Luke can accumulate way more damage from all the environmental effects and the attacks that Proxima does, which in turn allows him to maintain that high damage for a quicker clear. Similar to Luke Cage, Jessica Jones can also tank through the final phase of Null, which gives her just enough time to complete the mode before the timer ends. That said, I was able to complete stage 3 in about 4 minutes and 20 seconds, which is just roughly 5 seconds slower than Luke Cage's clear. For Giant Boss Raid, I was only able to make it to the halfway point, so about 40 bars, in roughly 3 minutes and 10 seconds. And that's primarily due to the huge penalties in Giant Boss Raid if your character is not at level 70. You can see this because once I got the character to level 70, I was able to get to the same halfway mark in about a minute and 30 seconds. which is 1 minute and 40 seconds faster than when I had the character at level 60. Then after 3 minutes and 22 seconds, I was able to clear the entire thing. Then with the Transcendence upgrade, I finished the same thing in almost exactly 2 minutes, which compared to the other results is about 10 seconds faster than Luke Cage and 20 seconds slower than Daredevil. It's also about 1 minute and 20 seconds faster than when she was just at level 70. Lastly, for Iron Fist, I previously completed Thanos in about 3 minutes and 20 seconds. Then with the Transcendence, I cleared the same thing in about 2 minutes and 15 seconds, which equates to roughly 1 minute and 10 seconds faster. Call Obsidian, I only got down to the last 5 bars but couldn't finish the fight. But with the Transcendence, I got to the same point in 1 minute and 50 seconds faster, and then was able to finish the stage in roughly 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Similar to Luke Cage and Jessica Jones, Iron Fist can also tank Null's final phase because he has that uniform passive that gives him invincible when he's around the 50% health mark. But even if you decide to wait after Null's final phase animation, Iron Fist still has enough damage to get the job done. Giant boss raid I previously did in about 2 minutes and 50 seconds, and then with the upgrade I completed the same thing in about 1 minute and 40 seconds, which is roughly about 1 minute and 15 seconds faster. With all that data and comparison, I decided to make an infographic to summarize the findings and make it easier to see. The purpose of the video is to see which characters get the biggest improvements or upgrades with their respective T3 and Transcendence, and from the results on this page you can clearly see that Luke Cage is the clear winner. Not only does he get a huge damage and HP upgrade with his Transcendence, but he also shaves off close to 2 minutes on every mode across the board, which is also nearly a full minute improvement compared to the other characters. Now, I'm not going to take the time to compare each character to one another in terms of how quickly they completed each mode, but the comparison there is that Daredevil or Iron Fist are probably on the same level. Iron Fist might be a little bit faster for clearing the content, and then Jessica Jones and Luke Cage are on par but slower than the other two. After I finished this testing, I worked some of my magic to get Daredevil, Iron Fist, and Luke Cage around the top 10 rank, with Luke Cage even going as high as second. I'm not really going to go into details on the builds in this video because it will get way too long, but suffice it to say, I gave Daredevil a regen CTP as well as Luke Cage, and I gave Iron Fist a destruction, since I also wanted to test his capability in PvP. At this point, I took all 4 characters into Giant Boss Raid to see how they would perform, and it pretty much aligns with what I said previously, which is that Iron Fist and Daredevil are pretty much on par with one another and faster than Luke Cage and Jessica Jones, which those two are on par with one another. I kind of messed up on the testing for Iron Fist a little bit because I jumped the gun and gave him a damage proc. Although I did the Galactus runs after I changed the builds on the characters a little bit, so these are just general numbers and to be taken with a grain of salt. But I'm sure that based on the previous findings that the results would more than likely match up. Now the PvE comparisons are pretty interesting and all, but these characters were basically built for PvP. You'll notice that I have a couple of buffs up top there, and those are because I'm in the Challenger League and they give you buffs that I can't remove during testing. To make the conditions more fair, I decided to fight myself, so the buffs are equivalent on both sides, and furthermore I went in only with Wasp's leadership and passive so that I don't have any additional buffs. As you can see, the first fight that I tested here is on full auto, and that works for me because Daredevil is good enough where I don't have to even touch the controls. He can solo the whole team himself. And I have to say that this is pretty ridiculous because he's taking on 2 Reflect characters with iframe ignores as well. Just to give you perspective, my Sentry and Dormammu are ranked in the top 5, and my Surfer is ranked in the top 40. To add to that, all 3 of these characters have reforged regens, with penetration going higher than 50%, and for Sentry it goes as high as 80% since I was lucky enough to roll a brilliant regen. Anyways, for this run I'm doing a manual just to show you how easy it is if you wanted to play yourself. Basically off the start, use your 5th skill because you get a very quick iframe, then you can follow up with the 4th skill or the 3rd skill to get that quick counter insta-kill. If the 3rd skill gets interrupted, then the 4th skill actually provides a lot of security. Not only does it make you totally immune to guard break penetration, meaning you can't get interrupted in any way, such as with Jean's 5th skill for example, but it also guard break penetrates. So similar to Jean's 5th skill, while the 4th is being casted, then your opponent will essentially be head rocked and interrupted. And yeah, it's as simple as that. If you're fighting characters that can reflect damage, it's often a good idea to use the 5th skill because you can't take reflect damage while you're in iframe. But yeah, compared to the 4 defender characters, I'd say that Daredevil is the second best PvP character of the bunch, and you'll see why that is in a second. As you could have guessed from the huge upgrades and the results earlier in the video, Luke Cage easily takes the top spot for the best improved character of the four, specifically in relation to PvP. I mean, just watch what he does to my top built meta characters. He literally only needs 2 skills, the 3rd skill to charge up his damage and the 5th skill to basically end the fight. And if he by some chance doesn't kill you with his 5th skill, the HP upgrades he got as well as the HP that he gets from his uniform make him so tanky, especially with the regen, that if he survives the 30 seconds for his awakening skill, it's pretty much game over. Although I probably shouldn't say if, but when. Also, you might notice this on autoplay that Luke conveniently uses his 3rd skill, usually when a character spawns in, and that's often when they use their counter or iframe ignore skill. And you'll see that in a second here when Silver Surfer respawns. And there you go. And dead. He's so good now that people are even running him in Challenger League over characters that have revives. And you may have noticed that I'm not even using Jessica Jones on this team, because if I did, he would be even tougher to kill than he is now. If you want to use Luke Cage on manual, then there really isn't too much to him. All you really have to use is the 3rd and the 5th skill, and that's it. Occasionally you can use the 4th skill if you want to avoid some damage and go into an iframe, but other than that you don't even really need to use his awakening skill, he's just that good. For a free-to-play option like this that can take out metas that are fully stacked, I'd highly recommend getting his uniform and upgrading him at least to Awakening, but also transcending him for that huge stat boost. If you're fighting against a Luke Cage, then if you see him use his 3rd skill, just run. Don't attack him, just run. I mean, one thing you can do is use skills that have immunity to guard break penetration, like I mentioned previously with Daredevil's skill. But if you don't happen to kill him in the time that you use that skill, then his damage accumulation is probably going to be maxed out. And if he goes into his 5th skill, then you're in trouble. But it is kind of a tricky balance, because if you don't attack him for too long, then his awakening skill will go off cooldown, and then you're kind of screwed. I've seen some people say that Luke struggles to kill blast types, like Jean for example, but to be honest, I'm not really seeing it. If he does his 3 and then goes into his 5, and Jean doesn't use her 5th skill, then it's game over, it doesn't matter. The type enhancement won't make a difference, and you can see that here because my Jean is type 6 enhancement and it doesn't make a difference at all. I mean, it could probably be harder to kill her if she had Colossus passive, but the damage accumulation is just too much. The last thing that I wanted to show off here in Timeline is that Iron Fist does actually have some value in PvP. I mean, you probably don't want to use him in Timeline because he just doesn't stack up, especially when you're only using 3 characters. But the results that I got on Auto and Timeline give me an idea that he does have some usability in Alliance Conquest. And if you end up using a Destruction CTP like I have, you can basically get the benefit of using him in both PvE and PvP. If you do end up wanting to use the character in PvP, then I highly recommend that you have a custom gear at least with immunity to guard break. When I tried testing without this stat, it was basically no good at all. His skills would constantly get interrupted before he even went into his iframes. And even though Iron Fist is great for PvE, he does have tools to work in PvP. So he has that invincible when he gets down to 50% health on his uniform, as well as the heal, and the 5th does a lot of damage with a pretty decent length iframe. Now, I'm not advocating that you should build him for PvP, I'm just showing you what he can possibly do. It's totally up to you what you want to do with your own builds. The last thing I want to look at here is how these characters perform in Alliance Conquest. Since I already know that these characters are really good, especially together, then I wanted to test on the gold standard, which is the JTC team, which consists of Jean, Thanos, and Colossus. And as you can see from the first test, they don't really provide any kind of problems at all. With the awakening skills ready to go in the second fight, there isn't really much point for me to show this, you know what's going to happen. Although this fight is more a direct counter to Hulk, and it's what most players will use the team for, I was curious to see how the defenders would fare when there's a reflector and iframe ignore character on the team, i.e. Silver Surfer. As you can see, the synergy between the 3 characters is so good that there isn't much problems caused here. That said, from the testing that I did, you don't really need all 3 characters together, just 2 of each of the 4 works just fine. The one time you might want to use all 3 characters together is if you are putting them as a defensive barrier or if you want a guaranteed win against big metas. So one thing I was experimenting with was how to split up the characters to get the most value from them. One of the teams that I really liked and that worked really well for me was using Luke Cage leadership and Daredevil as the secondary damage dealer. Luke provides that great debuff removal and also that physical damage immunity, which really helps against the combat types that counter Daredevil. In the 3rd position, I tested out a strong blast type character like Professor X, who rounded out the team in terms of type, so you have blast, speed, and combat, in addition to locking down characters with a lot of CC effects. You can see that even though this zone is strafed and the characters that I'm fighting aren't necessarily in my favor, that this team still holds up pretty well even without the use of Jessica Jones. And what I mean by not in my favor is that none of the characters on the other team are fully physical based. Thanos is the only one that's partially physical. The rest all deal energy damage, including Apocalypse. Even still, when I saw that Thanos, Sentry, and Silver Surfer were on the 2nd team for this fight, I had to use this combo. Considering how tanky Luke is, I was almost 100% sure that if Jean didn't use her 5th skill, he would easily survive into the 2nd round and then use his Awakening skill. And since I knew that one Awakening skill wouldn't kill this entire team since they're revives, I wanted to see who the last one standing was. And no surprise, it was Luke Cage. Considering how well Luke Cage and Daredevil were working together, I wanted to test out a different support character in the 3rd spot depending on the teams that I was fighting. So since the other 2 characters could hold their own, I tried Ebony Maw when I faced a full Universal team. And as expected, with those iframe ignores and high survivability, they pretty much swept the fight. I didn't really get a chance to test out the other half of the defenders as much, but the team that I would definitely recommend is using Jessica Jones in the leadership position and Iron Fist as the damage dealer. And you obviously want to use this team versus a strong physical meta like Hulk or Null. You'll see that Iron Fist provides great burst damage, especially with Jessica Jones' passive, and he's hard to kill because of her passive as well, and because he has that invincible when he's at 50% health. I wasn't really able to test out too many 3rd options for this team, but the one that I thought worked out pretty well was Captain America, because he has his own self debuff removal. But I definitely recommend using the Hydra uniform if you put them on the team so you don't have only one type. But yeah, that rounds out the end of the video. If there's anything to take away from this, it's that you should definitely get Luke Cage's uniform and transcend him, and then get Daredevil if you're more into PvP, or Iron Fist if you're more into PvE. Jessica Jones is also a great option, but compared to the other 3, she falls more into the support category. Anyways, sorry if the video was a bit long, but I thought there was a lot of good information that I wanted to share with you guys. As always, if you found the information useful or helpful, then please consider subscribing or leaving a like and a comment. Thanks for your time, but the video is now over.